Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the third in the series of 6 webinars for grounding museum futures. My name is Carmel Borch. I am the head of the Department of Arts, Open Communities, and Adult Education within the Faculty of Education, University of Malta. We are the host, the department for these webinars, and we see this series as an extension of one of our core activities within the department. That's the Master in Museum Education. We also see these webinars as a run-up to a major event which will be happening next year, October 2021, in the form of an international conference featuring MUŻE.X, Shaping Museum Futures. Let me bring in our major collaborators to start with Spazio Creative, who have provided us, thankfully, with this incredible space. Most of you would have recognized the fact that we have moved into another space from the theater into the music room. Thank you very much, Spazio Creative, for this fantastic space, modern rendering, housed within a fantastic and very impressive 16th century structure. A war machine, so to speak, part of a 16th century military infrastructure aimed at defending our capital, Valletta. I also want to mention Valletta Cultural Agency, the main sponsors of this event, as well as University of Malta Valletta campus for providing also some technical help. I'm not organizing this event on my own. I have two very dear friends and colleagues from Portland, Mike Murawski. Mike, hello. Mike is an independent consultant, a change leader and author based in Portland. He's also the co-producer of Museums Are Not Neutral. And Mike will be with us, hopefully, come October next year as a keynote speaker. To my left, a dear friend, colleague, and collaborator, our specialist within the department in museology, art history, and curatorial practice, Sandro De Bono. Sandro is the brains behind MUŻE, the National Community Museum, the flagship project, so to speak, for the Valletta 2018 Capital of Culture event. Sandro will be introducing the main speaker for today. Up to you, Sandro.
Thank you, Carmel. Thank you, everybody. Hi, Mike. Hope all is well with you. Hi, once again. Hello to everyone, wherever you are. I've been seeing all the comments coming up on the chat. Denmark, USA, Bologna, Hastings. We're practically neighbors. We're spread all over the world, but we're here together this evening, this morning, depending on wherever you are, to have some good conversations with our special guest, Alistair Hudson. And it's my pleasure to welcome you, Alistair, to this third webinar in the series of 6 pre-conference webinar events. For those of you who might not know Alistair, we did share some of his talks on social media during the build-up to this webinar. Alistair is currently the director of the Whitworth and Manchester Art Gallery. Previously, he was the director of the Middlesbrough Institute of Modern Art. He is also the co-director of the Asociación de Arte Útil, which is a very interesting project, which I'm sure will be coming up in the conversation today. And he is also well known for his vision of the useful museum. I think it's version 3.0, not 2.0. Right, Alistair?
Yeah, 3, that's right.
3.0. The floor is yours.
That might feature in the discussion as well.
Great. So the floor is yours. We're all looking forward to listen to what you have to say and to have some good discussions afterwards with Mike and all the rest of us.
Great. Well, thank you very much for having me. It's yeah, it's a real honor to be in Malta. If only I could be there in person, but you know, maybe again at some point. Okay, so I'm going to share screens now, if this all works, hopefully. So if I select,
all right,
that seems to be good. Can everybody see this? How's that? Good? Okay, so I wanted to kind of give this talk a slightly mischievous title. So I'm calling this Anti-Exhibitionism, with the subtitle, The Fall of the Representational and the Rise of the Operational in Museum Culture. And I'm really going to use quite specific and concrete examples of the work that I'm currently involved in order to kind of extrapolate that thinking. And I'm starting this with an image that I always start most of my talks with, because it's still pertinent and useful, if you'll pardon the word. And this is the image of Caspar David Friedrich's Wander Above the Sea of Fog, who I consistently refer to as the box cover image for the software of modernity. So this is the solitary white male genius artist striding above the clouds, really the personification of autonomous art, of art which has created the avant-garde and the idea of art being somehow separate from the world, operating in the world of representation. And it follows that the software engineer behind this is the philosopher Immanuel Kant, who prescribed the duality or the kind of the two pillars of art of being defined by purposeless purpose and the disinterested spectator. And it is this, in a way, this kind of mechanism, this architecture that he created over 200 years ago, which I kind of see as being the formula which created the current version of art as we know it, the current operating system that we currently have. And this is one, in a way, which has created a world of things that we call art, which are a subset of all the things in the world. But the other things that are not in that subset of art are not art. And it is that really that clear decision-making, that clear prescription of what art is, that has created a divining system which has allowed for, complicit with capitalism, with industrialization, with modernity and colonialism, to create a version of art in the art museum which effectively services an increasingly narrower number of people. This is the system which in a way is underpinned, or actually underpins, the art market and the sort of global, the global system of the modern and subsequently the contemporary that has created our current worldview of art, certainly through the museum sector. In trying to sort of unpick this world, because I think we are very much at the moment when there's an era coming to an end. And again, this is a diagram I use consistently to try and explain what I mean by this. And I call this sort of the Parabolic Arc of Modernity. And it begins somewhere in around 1848 with revolution in Europe, with mass industrialization and really sort of high-speed modernity, and ends somewhere at about 1989 with the fall of the Berlin Wall and the rise of the World Wide Web. And beyond 89, of course, we have increasing globalization, an increasing relinquishment of power and influence by Europe per se, and I suppose a realization that the hold that Europe, or at least European sensibilities, had on culture, on world culture, were coming to an end. And this is also manifest in the crash of 2007 and 2008. So we're now entering this other phase where, you know, all the things we thought were solid, we're calling into question. And the coronavirus, I would also argue, is part of that review of where we are at the moment, certainly from a Western perspective, as equally you might argue the global ecological catastrophe. So in order to try and escape this bubble, or sort of move on from this bubble, which was, you know, had the gravitational center here in the West, I was interested in looking at other versions of art or other ways of thinking about art that may have been prior to this, or even running through this at various points, but were suppressed or not given sufficient visibility or credibility. And certainly in the Anglo-centric world, which when it comes to it, is the environment that I have grown up in. The history of art production and visibility prior to the 1848 moment was through something called the Mechanics Institute movement, which was a kind of mass network of education centers for the working classes, where the arts and sciences were taught simultaneously. And this was about art operating in society. It was about people learning how to use artistic competence in industry, in craft, in social design, in creating things that were contributing to the kind of to the social commons. But interestingly, the content of over these 300 or so mechanics institutes from around Britain were coalesced in 1851 in the Great Exhibition in London. And as all good curator scholars know, the Great Exhibition of 1851 is a sort of a prime moment in the evolution of art, of social history, and really, I suppose, something from my perspective marks the beginning of the spectator economy. That this material that was developed through mechanical processes of using art for social good suddenly became a mass spectacle that was used for political gain, that was used for trying to reinforce Britain's status as a colonial superpower. So really going from this realm of operation to a realm of representation. And interestingly, this exhibition was in effect copied by Manchester some years later in 1859 with the Great Art Treasures exhibition, and again in a temporary glass architectural structure, and was then in fact, and I think still is, the largest collection of paintings and works of art ever shown in one space, with over 20,000 works of art in one building. And this was really Manchester trying to flex its muscles. It was trying to do the greatest exhibition the world had ever seen, because it could do it better than London, because Manchester was growing as the rising epicenter of capitalism, of mercantilism, of industry, and what was actually then known as the Manchester School of Economics. Which was something in a way we have begun to live with ever since. Now, another figure in all this that I find quite interesting, he's a complicated character. I don't agree necessarily with all his principles, but I use him quite a lot as a cipher, is the artist, art critic, social reformer, sort of 19th century man of all trades, John Ruskin. And John Ruskin, then the most famous art critic, social commentator in the country, was invited to come and give a lecture in Manchester alongside the Great Art Treasures exhibition, in a way to give his stamp of authority on this mass spectacle. But interestingly, instead of choosing to come and give a lecture about art, he proceeded to give a lecture actually over 2 nights, with each lecture being 1.5 hours long each. With an audience in the hundreds. And he, rather than talk about art, he gave a lecture on political economy. And his lecture, this is the transcript here, The Political Economy of Art, which also had the subtitle, A Joy Forever, was really a proposition to his audience that they had got art all wrong, that they had created this mass exhibition that was really just about demonstrating power, and was misusing art as a way to gain cultural capital and to gain financial capital in the world, and was not actually about what art was all about, which was a process which was about the transformation of society on the individual level, but also in the commons as well. And interestingly, this book actually was then rewritten later on, and by Ruskin, and became really the treatise that founded the Labour Party and a lot of the socialist movements in the UK for sure, but also went on to influence people like Gandhi and various organisations around the world. But this extraordinary book, in a way, which laid out an idea of art as being something that should be used in ordinary life processes, was picked up by many people. And interestingly, this runs through a kind of an alternative history of art institutions that were not necessarily museums, in the sense that was growing in the market economy of the 19th century. And there were, interestingly, three key institutions for me that were operating simultaneously in conversation with one another. The first one was this one, which was Toynbee Hall in the East End of London. And taking sort of Ruskin's ideas, the idea was to set up an institution for Cambridge and Oxford students in the slums of the East End of London, where the most poorest populations were, and to show them and to give them education in art, in craft, in politics and economics, and really to give them a sort of all-round experience of, I suppose, how to live a better life, whilst providing regular meals with communal dining rooms, legal advice, healthcare, and so on and so forth. And in return, in a way, the students would get a better understanding of how the world worked, and theoretically become better political leaders and decision makers in the future. So a rather sort of Victorian top-down idea of an institution. And this was in effect seen and copied by and taken over the Atlantic to Chicago by Jane Addams, another kind of social reformer operating out of Chicago at the same time in the late 19th century, who under the influence of John Dewey, who I suppose is kind of an American Ruskin, created the Whole House settlement in Chicago, which was basically a very similar operation, possibly on a larger scale, with up to 700 housing units, an art gallery, art studios, schools, healthcare centres, and in fact was the birthplace of art therapy, to create a similar kind of institution that was also in conversation with Toynbee Hall. And then thirdly, in Manchester itself, which was then the epicenter of industrial growth through the cotton industry, which was filled with smoking factories like this, and also is the site of Marx and Engels' study of the working classes and their research of working class culture in the 19th century, became the site for the Manchester Art Museum, which was created by one of Ruskin's disciples, you might say Thomas Horsfall, along similar grounds. And this is now been demolished, but its collections are now part of the museums which I am now in charge of. But in principle, this was not an art gallery for pure pleasure, but an educational centre in the poorest, most deprived area of Manchester, possibly the world, amongst the filth of the factories, to show a way of better living through nature and good design, essentially. A lot of these kind of methodologies and strategies you can trace through the 19th and 20th centuries, and most famously come to fruition in something like the Bauhaus with its holistic curriculum, which has its origins in those 19th century movements, but really equally establishes firmly, I think, what I call the best intentions of modernity. So whilst I have many criticisms of how complicit modernity was as a movement, as an idea, with colonization and exploitation on a global scale, equally there were of course people who were trying to do good things and make the world a better place for people in all kinds of ways. So it's on the back of these kind of threads of art operating in society, rather than in the autonomous realm of the gallery or the museum or the canon, in fact, that some years ago, around about 2011, 2012, a number of conversations came to the surface from what I call fellow travelers, other institutions, and in particular the Van Abbe Museum in Eindhoven, and the artist Tania Bruguera, who you can see here, who had previously coined the term arte útil, art as a tool, as it's translated from the Spanish. And what we were all interested in doing was escaping this, this modern paradigm, the romantic paradigm of the West, of the kind of the Northern Hemisphere, and to seeing, given that the world was changing, how could we create forms of art which would adapt to this? And it seemed that, in a way, sort of to be heretical and bring in this idea of use value back into art, where, you know, it had been defined so clearly by the Kantian paradigm to be of not, its purpose was to have no purpose. To challenge that seemed like probably, you know, kind of the most pertinent thing we could do to try and pull down this edifice and rebuild something else that was more fit for our times. And in this process of looking at the, you know, of looking at ways in which this could be enacted, we also looked at various other histories that talked about this idea too. It's not a new idea. So, you know, Ruskin's lectures here on the use of art. People like Juan O'Gorman in 1933 writing an Arte Útil manifesto in Mexico, or Pino Poggi in Italy, who also created Arte Utile in the 1960s, and Eduardo Costa in the US in the late 60s as well, talking about similar ideas and similar things. But on the back of this, we created basically a kind of movement, a kind of structure, an international network of people who could be connected and share these ideas and start to grow essentially an online platform where these things could be discussed and promoted, I suppose. And as part of this, we created a list of criteria which would describe the kinds of projects we were interested in or thought were manifest realizations of this way of thinking. And this is really about art projects which produce very clear beneficial outcomes, and ones which are attempting to directly affect social change. So rather than pointing at a problem, they actually do something about it. Or rather than being an image of something, they are the thing itself. So this, when we talk about these projects being on the one-to-one scale, it means they are actually the thing, the process that's being enacted by a group or by an individual or by people, rather than an artist producing, you know, an image of intention. And really what then followed was an accumulation of hundreds of case studies from around the world, which became the Arte Útil archive, a growing archive that's still growing and mapping different territories around the world to show actually, both historically and presently, that these projects exist and that they operate in parallel to and in and amongst the existing art world, rather than being something that's necessarily new. So here we have Project Row Houses, which is Rick Lowe's projects in the States of sort of basically building houses as an art project. This is projects in Indonesia, which develop kind of new approaches to urbanism and architecture, agricultural projects in China, and even here in Argentina, sustainability projects, which are actually trying to address issues and actually doing something about changing, the kind of cultural economic scenario in which they're operating. Or even things that are slightly more political or economic, like this project by MUŻE.X, which, for example, piggybacked an offshore tax haven for an activist group in Spain, so that they could basically take advantage of all the loopholes and benefits afforded by regular kind of users of these offshore accounts. So these hundreds of case studies were amassed, and in 2012 we sort of created at the Van Appe Museum the Museum of Arte Útil, which was the presentation of all these case studies and was about bringing the museum to life, rather than actually creating a static exhibition. But from this really flowed a series of projects and invitations from around the world as people got more interested in this idea. And this is, for example, is one of a series of a escuela of Arte Útil that we undertook. This is in San Francisco at the Yerba Buena Center, where for 7 weeks we run a course, Tanya and the guest artists, on the ideas of Arte Útil. And here you can see some of the kind of diagrams and blackboards and so on in order to kind of present this as a form of education. But kind of I'm going to summarize really the transition that I'm talking about here, clearly with this diagram. And really what we're talking about here is art moving beyond art, of art moving out of that autonomous sphere into the world at large and being operational within it. We're talking about moving from autonomy to ecology, which I would argue is possibly the opposite of that, about art interconnected with all things in the world. We're interested in basically moving away from spectatorship into active usership, from authorship into the world of initiation. So rather than the solitary genius artist having sole province and claim to the work of art, the artist actually then starts processes which can then be taken up by other people. I've talked about representation becoming operation. So it's actually, you know, the thing itself we're doing. Interestingly, I'd like to make a claim to lose the word audiences, certainly within the museum context. If we are to escape this duality of spectatorship and the attention economy, we really need to move into a realm where we stop thinking about the audience as being some other out there we have to get into the museum or to engage, you know, with art. But actually the reality is a multiplicity of networks or constituencies who have an interest. They are not disinterested, but actively interested in the things that they are concerned with. And as such, the challenge for me, I think, is to move beyond the collection of artworks, which we still do, but move into the world of collecting also relationships and developing relationships as something that actually is at the heart of what art and museums should be about. There are various theories and publications that we have made, in particular the Lexicon of Usership by Stephen Wright, which it lays out a lot of this terminology. But a key term, as was mentioned earlier, for me is the Museum 3.0. And in a way, this is my software for how I am attempting to transform the function of the museum in a way that is fit for now. So I would describe the Museum 1.0 as the archetypal kind of 19th century version, which is you put, you know, the object in the museum, people come in the museum, they see that thing, they're somehow transformed individually by it, and then they go away and somehow are better citizens. The Museum 2.0 is the sort of more 20th century, late 20th century version of participation, where people go into the museum to participate in the production of culture, but is still basically participating in someone else's agenda, participating in an agenda which is limited by the central power that really constitutes the art world. So the Museum 3.0 is an attempt to create a user-generated or a constituent-led museum, where there is a collectivized consensus around what kind of projects need to be done by the institution that work for the constituencies around it, rather than something that is delivered to them. So how do we actually go about applying this theory? And as was described at the beginning, I've run a number of institutions historically, but the biggest yet is the challenge in Manchester, where I became director just over 2.5 years ago, running the two main art museums in the city. And the first one is the Whitworth Art Gallery, founded in 1889. Which is a large Victorian institution, part of the university, that was redeveloped in 2015, like many millennial museum developments, to expand, to contemporize an old building with a kind of major architectural intervention to expand the spaces, to make a very beautiful building. But the challenge is, once that's built, what the hell do you do with it? What's the point? Is it just to be a spectacle? Is it just to be a beautiful building that looks like something that operates in the global hegemony of contemporary art? Or does it actually, have a purpose within its context? And interestingly, the Whitworth is situated in a very interesting location, not in the city centre, but in the boundary between the university to the north of the gallery. So the gallery is here in the centre, in a park. The university and the city centre is to the north, and all around it on three sides are the neighbourhoods of Moss Side, Fallowfield, Hume, and Brunswick, which are, historically the most challenged communities in the city, synonymous with, for example, race riots in the 1980s, with poverty, housing deprivation, etc., etc. So in a way, that is our neighbourhood. That is the neighbourhood we are in. And what the gallery has been doing for the last years is trying to learn how to live with those communities and be part of them, as it was when it was originally founded. So the Whitworth Institute Park was in fact created as an institute of the manner I talked of before, with very specific purpose. It was to instill visual literacy in the working classes of Manchester, to teach them art so that they would become basically better equipped to produce good design for and make a generation of makers and machinists and producers to fire Manchester forward as a global superpower. But equally, it was a site with its park and its art collection as a site of therapy, to create a good mind, body, and spirit for the people of the city. So when I started, the first instance of laying down a trajectory for the future of the gallery was basically to do an exhibition called A Joy Forever, after Ruskin's lecture, which was a kind of illustrated lecture, but also a kind of exhibition as manifesto as the way we were going to proceed. And this was not an exhibition that would start and finish, but an exhibition that would start a continual process that would evolve for years and years and years to come, that would begin the transformation of the museum as something autonomous into something that was truly part of the ecology of the city. And many of the projects in this were actually demonstrations or proposals for projects that we would then follow. And interestingly, one of those was a project by Ruskin that you might describe as a socially engaged art project from 1884 with his art students at Oxford, where he got them to build a road as an education, to show them what a good working day was like, but also to give them basically an education in nature, in production, in economics, and so on and so forth, with a philosophical lunch every day. It was a bit of a joke at the time, and it was in political cartoons of the time. But we took this idea and worked with the architect Takashi Hayatsu to draw up this plan, which is now being constructed for a new road in the park adjacent to the gallery, which again would be a communal garden planted around a central road, handmade, with all the bricks made by people, by the neighbours around us, by university students. There would be classrooms, dining, open-air dining, a park keeper's house as a proposition for new kinds of housing that would really be a longitudinal education in life and in ecology and in and amongst these communities, as a way of demonstrating and thinking through doing how we might go about social transformation. At the same time as well, we launched another project with that opening exhibition, which was to give one of the main gallery spaces to a community group from the neighbouring streets. And as it happened, there was a local group who were archiving a history of a nightclub called the Reno, which was in Moss Side, and the nightclub was the centre of the Afro-Caribbean community and the mixed communities of that neighbourhood, but also it was the centre of the race riots in the 1980s, and was subsequently demolished in the process of regeneration. And this group, as part of their oral history of this nightclub, to reclaim their history, also undertook then an archaeological dig to remove items from the site, such as glasses, ashtrays, jeans, bags of drugs. And these were then presented in the museum as an exhibition, but also as a working workshop to tell this story and grow it over time, over a year, that they inhabited this space and they held workshops and they constructed basically a way of working which would allow them to use the museum to give them agency and power in their community, but also talk to the city and talk to the wider world about this erased history, and really an alternative story of how these communities had been suppressed and brutalized by forces which we then were considering as being regenerative or as transformational. This project is still evolving, but it also then starts to influence other projects that we do, which are presented primarily or possibly as exhibitions, but the exhibition is not their major format. And next year we're doing a project with the collective Forensic Architecture, who some of you may know, who use basically digital media to work with groups from around the world to fight human rights cases where there have been human rights abuses, to demonstrate basically the truth of a situation where possibly it's been erased or used illegally by governments or by police forces. And really this is about fighting for justice. So what's interesting about them is they use the museum system as the primary vehicle in order to enact and give the cases for their legal cases before they go to court. Similarly, next year we're also holding a version of a major retrospective of the American artist and activist Suzanne Lacy, kind of the godmother of social practice, possibly. And this is, we worked for a long time with SF MoMA, who presented a fairly canonical, traditional presentation of Suzanne's work from over 5 decades. But what we're doing next year is, whilst we are doing an exhibition, the idea is to make the exhibition come to life and to make it durational in time and to remake the historical projects in the city now, so that they go beyond the confines of the gallery walls. But we use the exhibition as a manual for groups locally to see how they might make those transformations. An example would be her Oakland projects from the Bay Area in California from the 1990s, working with Black youth and police and civic leaders to change policy and outcomes for youth from that region. Obviously now that's not relevant in Manchester, so how would we remake this project now with the communities around us? And interestingly, rather than us going to them, a leader who was previously a gang member in Moss Side, who'd been basically been in prison for crimes with weapons, has started a new group and approached Suzanne Lacy to see if she would make Oakland projects for Manchester now. And then that connected us up with the museum. So we are now working on developing a version of this project for the city, which will be, in effect, the exhibition come to life. Here, working with kind of kids from a local youth academy. Another, I suppose, transformation or a way to try and escape the constraints of the exhibition format. We're now also planning for 2 years' time with, in a way, it's like the sum of this first chapter in the development and history that started with Ruskin's lecture on economics and ends in 2023 with a project we're calling Economics the Blockbuster, which I suppose mischievously is a blockbuster exhibition about the thing that's most unlike anything you would want to have a blockbuster exhibition about, i.e. economics. But this really is about an exhibition about trying to open up the world of economics to actually being what it really is, which is how do we create a better operating system for society and reclaim it from the current systems that we have and propose new solutions to an economic system in terms of social justice, in terms of housing, in terms of ecology, that is actually active. So we're starting this process now with the idea that this project will in turn transform institutions, that it will take over the whole institution and again influence policy. And as part of this, we will run with the university a kind of quasi global business school to teach a new form of economics to possibly the future business leaders in the future. Down the road, the other museum I'm in charge of is the Manchester Art Gallery, which is in the city centre and is the kind of civic institution with the columns. Again, has its foundations in the Institute movement, founded in 1823 as an education centre for the working classes that later acquired an art collection. And interestingly, in the original plans I found by Charles Barry from 1823, in Latin on the front cover, it did actually say nothing beautiful unless useful. So I felt rather, well, certainly I'd been given permission to realize this philosophy in this institution. And I suppose the challenge also in all this is how do you actually move your collections beyond the exhibitionary? How do you move them beyond being an isolation chamber for objects and to make it basically a resource center for this material to use art in current debates and issues? And the first attempt at this was in collaboration with the artist Sonia Boyce, who initiated a collective action to remove this painting called Hylas and the Nymphs, which is basically a rather suspect Victorian painting of young naked women being or attempting to seduce a young man from the Hylas from the Greek myths, was temporarily removed to create a debate around female representation, which kind of exploded into an international social media shitstorm, with memes like this being created about how the museum was run by feminazis, as they were described at the time, curators who were trying to inflict their agenda and introduce politics into the world of museum where politics doesn't belong, etc., etc. But in a way, it did work in terms of bringing these issues to life, and in a way, bringing the works of art to life and in use in a very sort of global, digitized way, rather than the traditional experiential way of the one-on-one encounter with the work of art. A similar project, which is also about moving beyond the spaces and objects, was in the aftermath of a couple of years ago, we sadly had a very intense Islamicist attack on the city, where a suicide bomber killed 23 people at an Ariana Grande concert in the city. And this is the spontaneous memorial in the aftermath of flowers, teddy bears, notes, balloons, which we have then, at the invitation of the city, taken into the museum as a growing archive, basically preserving all these artifacts from the memorial as, in a way, an unknown, a therapy center with unknown future, where we don't really know what the value necessarily is of this at first. At the moment, we're just working with the families who've been affected by the atrocity, but over time will become a mechanism in which we can come to terms as a city, as a population, with these forms of violence, but is also connecting with other cities from around the world who've experienced similar incidents, to create a kind of global support network for how we might understand culture in a more rounded way, and understand culture is intricately linked with politics and economics and faith. And last year, again, as part of this, I suppose, politicization of the museum, again, working with long-standing partner Tanya Bagheera, we created what we called the School of Integration, to turn the museum back into an educational institution. And rather than the usual integration courses where migrants come to the UK and they're basically taught English and taught how to be English, and given a questionnaire on how much they know about British culture to decide whether they can be citizens or not. This was a school where migrants taught everybody else about their culture, where, with over 90 classes from all different languages, all different cultures, in politics, cooking, language, customs, everybody sharing together what their culture was, what it meant to them in a kind of rich celebration, but also amazingly intellectual and stimulating program that had an amazing impact on the institution, amazing impact on the city, on council policy, but also is continuing now online and starting to have different iterations elsewhere and running through the program continually. So I'm going to finish with a slide of the empty gallery. This was until recently a gallery where we did show exhibitions. It's called Gallery 1 in the scheme of things. And this is now being cleared out of artworks, and it's being redeveloped as a centre with the health service, with what we call health visitors in the UK, to run child development clinics. And this is really working with the National Health Service to encourage the development of children from the age of 0 to 5 before they go to school, and their parents. And but this is working with art from our collection and with them making art, but in a space which isn't an exhibition. It is a working space using art for purposes for education, for social development, for creating creative competence. And I think in a way that for me, this encapsulates, I suppose, the trajectory I'm interested in going in is not necessarily that you don't show art anymore. Of course you do. And of course you do exhibitions. But the primary focus, the primary energy is not about producing the exhibition that starts on this day and finishes on another day, but about producing projects which have real traction in the social sphere, and ones which generally work towards a transformation of society. The end. Shall I shall unshare?
Alistair, this is Mike chiming in. First of all, I should just say thank you for walking us through that. That was wonderfully dense in terms of packing a lot in history.
I'm afraid there's a lot more, and it's probably
well, we've got a lot of time to have a conversation, and I appreciate being able to kind of reflect on that and think about it a little bit more. Yeah, and I have so much respect for your experiences that you and the sort of work that you've led in museums. And I feel like there are so many projects that I'm familiar with that you haven't mentioned that I would love having a conversation about. I have a couple sort of bigger questions that are super interesting to me, but I kind of want to take a step back and maybe ask a few smaller ones to kind of slowly get towards it. One of the things that I really hear in your practice, but also when you write about your work or speak about this idea of Museum 3.0, is recognizing this continued transformation of museums, or at least a push to continue the transformation of museums to function differently. Yeah, I mean, when you show slides of a gallery with artworks and people are just walking around looking at them, it feels very familiar to a lot of museums that we probably visit. And these are art museums specifically, but certainly there are plenty, history museums, science museums that may be still the predominant experience, although that has been changing, as you mentioned, with the 2.0 model. So getting visitors and audience to be engaged, participating. So we've got more interaction, and the continued use of the word audience. I appreciated that you were critical of that, because I also think sometimes that it feels very consumerist, like we're still in a model of seeing people as sort of ticket buyers or people that we can collect marketing research data on to keep driving maybe the financial model of institutions forward. And I worked in performing arts for a while too, so I think that audience mindset is large in that field as well. But then the shift to this social, I would almost call it the social change model of museums, and you said so many times how do museums become part of the ecosystem of the place where they exist? So they're not just a building, or at one point I read something you wrote where you referred to museums as a spaceship landing from somewhere else. I think that's common experience. So how do we change that into something that is part of sort of the community social fabric and becomes useful and part of making our cities, towns, and communities better, and working with those places? So like within that framework, I have several questions, but one is, if you could talk a little bit about the impact that shift, that sort of really big shift that you're talking about, has on leadership and the role of individuals like yourselves within these institutions.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, again, a big question. I mean, obviously, it's quite a curious thing that when you come into an institution and you come in with all these ideas, so it can seem quite challenging to people. But I think in general, once you kind of unravel it, it's kind of, for me, it's kind of common sense. It's, like, why would you do this stuff? Like, what's this building for? What's the point of it? And when you start to unravel it, I think, a lot of people who've worked in, in curating and education, and I think everybody kind of, everyone's with it, and can understand, understand the direction. But inevitably, it does come across as being challenging. Although I find it sometimes quite hard to come to terms with. For me, it's kind of like normal. It just seems like really obvious to me, but then someone else says, "Oh no, it's really radical," and it's in a way, it's quite easy to be really radical in the art world, because the art world is so conservative. Even in the world of contemporary, I mean, in a way, that's where you get the most flack from, is from like people who are sort of from the contemporary establishment, who say, it's not art, it's social work, it's not art, it's geography or something like that. So of course you come up against challenge, but I think what I find is that all our various publics, I think, are quite relieved to buy into an idea of art that's actually working for them. That's working, with an intent to work in the commons, rather than trying to convert people to the languages and behaviors of the contemporary. And I think, that is, the art world is very weird and peculiar in that way. I've kind of worked in it for a long time, and I've worked in, I worked in a big commercial gallery in London for many years, and worked in the public sector and collections and social practice projects. And that one of art's big problems is that it did over specialize, and it became co-opted by a particular version of art, which was driven by the market and driven by capital and driven by people with particular power and particular interests. And that in a way has created, I say a lot that, people's suspicions of contemporary art are actually usually well-founded. It serves the market well for things not to be easily understood. Because if art becomes really super, useful everywhere, then its kind of heightened value is diminished. But at the same time, it's the double bind, because you need sort of popular appeal. You need your famous artists in order to, prop the whole thing up. So the art world plays this really weird, delicate balancing trick. So in a way, in terms of leadership, the challenge is to sort of make these interventions and make these changes, but to take people with you. Because I think for me, what, a lot of people want to say, well, this is go and do that version of art somewhere else. Or yeah, you can just do it in a museum here, but don't do it anywhere else. And it's not like I want every museum to do this and turn it into like the Starbucks of, social practice museums. But I think it is important that we, for me, that I try and change art, because I think the world does need art, and I think the last year has illustrated that more than ever. Is that what the world really needs is art, and by art I mean that in the broadest sense. That I define art as doing something with care and consideration. And I think the more we have that in life, the better. And I see it as the role of an art museum and institution to introduce care and consideration into the economic matrix. So yeah, I guess that does then become quite a complicated leadership role.
Yeah, and I feel like I always, whenever I meet someone like you, and I think this webinar series is one sort of museum leader after another that is advocating for a different model, a different future for museums. That's why we're sort of all together and having these conversations. But yet, if you look out there across the field, you're seeing, I think, something very different, largely. And I'm always curious, like, why it does. You said it does feel like common sense. I mean, to be shifting art and museums towards just doing good, especially now. Like, if you're not focusing on that now, what's wrong? But that isn't where everybody, from the US, I can speak more directly, but there are so many institutions that took this pandemic as an opportunity to kind of go in the opposite direction, to sort of go backwards in time a little bit and retract into kind of an older model of museums. What do you see, with all of your experience kind of being in the field of both art and museums, what do you see as some of the bigger barriers to getting museums to make some of these transformations to being, these sort of more social focused and political focused institutions?
Well, I think in a way the biggest challenge is to in a way take the wider population with you on the idea that actually this is what art is. We've been told that art is this, which is, let's say, the high art in the museums you've just described. That's one version of art that people have in their heads. But there's another version of art which is about art that is, is a tool to be used in ordinary life processes, and that is not a common equation. And of course, and so as long as art becomes an elitist activity, or it's it's an occupation of the 1%, or is serving the interests of a small number of people, or the powerful, or the market, or however we describe it, there's not going to be a general investment in the idea that art is a kind of healthy thing to have, in and around us all the time. So I can totally understand why a museum, given the economic models and business strategies that it has, would retract to become like an older version of museum, because you can have your museum patrons, they'll be your millionaires who can pump money in, they can be on the board, you can do your education programs and feel good about yourself every now and again, and have school groups coming around to see the Warhol show, but in the end it's still it's not really delivering what for my interest, for my purposes would be to have a genuinely public institution. And of course, it's fine to have those other versions of art as well. I'm interested in art because it's such a complicated, messy thing. And maybe it's okay that there are elitist art museums, but my view is don't expect the public to pay for them. In the UK, we're very privileged in that we have a system where we do get public funding, and both my museums are totally free to the public. There is an investment from the city council and from the university that means that they totally get the role that art plays in the city and the potential it has in transforming the lives of its residents, and part of the social contract is about creating these spaces and places in an equitable way. But if you're a billionaire and you want to run your own private art museum, fine. But that doesn't interest me. Well, it kind of interests me, but I'm not going to go work at one.
Well, and I had one more kind of just thought and question, because it's something that I've struggled a lot with in the work that I've done within art museums. But I know we've got some comments and some questions coming in. And I also want to bring Carmel and Sandra into it, because we've got a pretty big chunk of time left, and I appreciate the conversation. So one of the things that, and it's, I always come into some of these questions not having them fully framed yet. So apologies for the messiness of this one, but it's something that I've been thinking about a lot, especially now, not working within a museum, but sort of looking at them a lot from the outside and kind of how they're operating and how they're shifting and changing or not. As museums start to do, and I'll show a little sketch that I made while you were talking, because the image of the when you were talking about Immanuel Kant and the art and then not art. So having these definitions of and I made this little drawing. I don't know if it'll be backwards or not to you, but it has museums and then not museums. And I feel like over history, we've gotten very rigid about what is a museum, and then there's stuff that is not museum. And what you're talking about is really transforming a lot of the work of museums into that area of not museums. But then I reflect on the fact that it's not museums, and it's not what museums were intended sort of to do, possibly. And these are all things that are sort of, up for debate and conversation and all that, which is why they're interesting. But as I see museums, including ones that I've worked for, start getting into working on, you mentioned the Suzanne Lacey project, where it's getting into issues of gang violence and working with police and communities. As museums start to get really interested in mental health and therapy, and I've talked to many individuals that's their primary role within their institutions, is to do that work. I've seen museums work on restorative justice, housing, become a food bank, or struggle with issues of internet access within those communities. I think those are awesome things for museums to do, but then I wonder, do we need museums doing those things? Or are we somehow centering all of this on museums to continue to try to struggle to make those institutions relevant, when we know within at least a lot of the communities that I've worked in and talked to a lot of colleagues within museums, within those communities, those things are already happening. There's expertise, there are other nonprofits and organizations doing that work, and they're doing it from that level of expertise. So they have 30 years of experience doing police accountability work. And a museum doesn't have that experience. Suzanne Lacey doesn't necessarily even have that experience necessarily. So I always, and this is kind of a, I suppose you could say a little bit of a devil's advocate question, but at what point do we reflect on whether museums are the right places to be doing this work, or whether we should be figuring out better ways to invest directly into communities, nonprofits, and organizations that are doing this work better than museums can probably ever do it? At what role does at what moment does paying an artist a hefty fee to do an exhibition project become something that gets in the way of just paying that community, paying, refugees and migrant communities and the organizations they form to do this work that could be better?
Well, I have done that as well. I don't know it. Yeah, one thing which I think is firstly in terms of the Venn diagram model, we were holding up. Obviously, what I'm trying to do is escape that model, because actually that's not an accurate version of how the world works. There isn't a defined line. There aren't actually things that are art and things that are not art. We're told there are, because, but actually there are things that are a bit art. There are things that are like art. There are things that have a bit of art in them, like cooking or, healthcare. All these things have an art component. And in fact, we with the Arte Útil group, we did a project in Chicago last year as part of the Architecture Biennial. And we did a workshop with a mathematician, Eugenia Chang, on this idea of the coefficient of art, which is really liberating and something that I've been developing, which is to say, don't think, and this applies to the museum as well, it's like, don't think of whether something is art or not art. Think to what degree something is art. Like, how much art do we have in this thing? And once you can kind of open that door, and you can apply this to museum, don't think whether it's a museum or not, but kind of how much can a museum be manifest or involved in certain situations. Once you can do that, you kind of liberate yourself from this compartmentalization. And the kind of, to answer that leads into the second part of your question, which is, you kind of get a lot as well, which is, well, why can't, just let the social services people do social service, just let the doctors do the doctoring, just, all that kind of stuff. And I would say, until, I think we need museums until all that stuff works really well. But at the moment it doesn't. And as I said, the world needs art, or it needs creativity, or it needs different ways of looking at things and different ways of doing things. And what, you know, the kind of constellation of things we might describe as the art world or the museums world, or, you know, our artistic faculties bring into all equations is basically a diversification of approach, a kind of cognitive diversity, which you actually find once you start working in these situations with Suzanne Lacey and, you know, and the neighborhood group, or the clinicians across the road in the hospital, is that they actually also want it. It's not that they're doing a fine job, thank you very much. Is that actually, this is not about us doing it to them. This is about us all collaborating to use our different competencies to do something in a way that hadn't been done before. So for example, now all the dermatology students across the road in the hospital study art history through the Whitworth, because it is clinically proven that dermatology students who have a visual education are better at diagnosing skin conditions than clinicians who haven't, and actually even the algorithms that are produced to do that job. You know, similarly, you know, we're kind of doing work with, like I said, with the health visitors and development of children at 0 to 5. That stuff ordinarily goes on, but usually it's in a building, you know, with a suspended polystyrene ceiling with strip lights and dirty plastic toys, and, you know, and it's in a, you know, the aesthetics of the environment are not really conducive. Whereas actually they find that the results that they get of working in a different way with artistic processes, with artists, with curators, within the art gallery itself and environment, produce much better results. And it's not necessarily that we're not doing it instead of them, we're doing it together with them to bring into play what we can do. And this is a really big thing in terms of how basically the museum sector can work in society, which is not about, and this relates to audiences, it's not about trying to get people in to come and to take part in art. It's about looking at how we can get art to join in and enhance what people are already doing. And for me, actually, that's the equation that is far more productive, far more interesting, and is the route to get to the point where people go, oh yeah, this art thing's really great. It actually is really useful. It really helps us in our life, or it really brings X into my life. So yeah, I think those are the sort of parameters of which I kind of frame your question.
Okay, yeah. Alistair, now back to Malta. You got me really excited to start with, because your presentation speaks directly to my ideology and to my pedagogy. I'm a pedagogue to start with. You use the word transformation a lot in your presentation. Now, obviously, transformation as a concept is much deeper than change, and obviously it implies, you know, a profound change in terms of social relations within the community, the way, you know, the community reads the word, the way, you know, the community names the word, understands the word, and eventually acts on the word. Are you confident that, you know, your projects within the community will achieve transformation rather than change? And in line with Mike's question, as you know, many people around the world, millions of them, have been shortchanged by institutions. And after all, the museum is an institution. Are you confident then that the museum can achieve such, you know, social transformation, given the allergy that millions have for, you know, institutions?
I am, to a certain extent. I'm probably foolishly confident in that I, you know, like many people, I live in hope, and I'd rather have a go than not bother. But I think it can be done. I mean, it kind of following on from the conversation with Mike just before. It will work in varying degrees. Some things will fail. Some things do fail. Some things work really well, and through these processes, you obviously try and do more of the things that work well and less of the things that fail. But you learn collectively. And I think that's the important thing, is it doesn't become, in a way, you maintain a non-autonomous position. And if you have an ecological approach where you understand that you cannot do this on your own, and this has to be about working collectively as a society in order to make these transformations take place, then you can get somewhere. And I've seen it happen on I've seen it happen on a small scale, where I've worked in different scaled institutions before, and I'm beginning to see it on a larger scale. And actually, what's quite interesting about being in a position of running museums like the ones in Manchester is that you have, just because by the fact that they are powerful institutions, you have access to politicians, to civic leaders, to community groups in a way that people don't ordinarily do. And I think it's quite interesting to see how people from the neighborhoods around us can also begin to see how they can use the power of the institution to talk to power. Yeah. So I think all the components are there to make genuine transformation, but it takes a long time. I think I always say it takes 7 years. I don't know why, it sounds like a good number. But yeah, it takes a long time. And that's why, in a way, you won't crack it with one exhibition. But with the accumulation, you begin to change policy and you begin to change behavior.
I'm very much intrigued by the pedagogical dimension of your projects. And taking a concept from De Souza Santos, the concept of cognitive justice, how confident are you that there is, a strong element of cognitive justice within your projects, where, the voices, the polyphony of voices within the community are truly not only listened to, but affirmed?
Yeah, I think that the way we try and do that is by giving power to them, because the danger is that that the habits in the world of museology are that we're in control and we tell the story. Mm-hmm. And part of this this transformation that we're making is about relinquishing power and a redistribution of power in terms of the narrative, in terms of the language, in terms of the use of the museum itself. Mm-hmm. So that we begin to offer up the spaces of the museum for others to use in ways that they want to, rather than us having supreme control. Right. And there are all kinds of barriers to do. I mean, even things like conservation, like can you have liquid in a gallery space, is traditionally a complete no-no in a museum. So these are all kind of micro battles along the way. But you begin to see, when you give permission to people and you are open and transparent and you can build trust, that actually they can begin to see it as a place that is theirs rather than the place that is someone else's. And at the moment, we're in this in-between state, inevitably, where you have, a lot of people say, oh yeah, art museums, it's not for me. It's for someone else. And because it's not art as it is presented, it's not in their normal rituals, cultures, language, behaviors, etc. But once you can demonstrate that through use, and this is why for me usership is so important as a terminology, is by use you then start to transform behaviors and attitudes as well. And we're making at the moment what we call a constituent city board for the museum, because so that really we can the decision-making processes start to get dissolved.
Yeah. So are communities responsible for generating the themes, for initiating the investigation? Who initiates the project?
At the moment, we're in an in-between stage. The point where I like to get to is where all the projects are determined by the constituents, because it's, or at least and there's a consensus that basically establishes what the objectives are. But of course, at the moment, until you change the behavior, you have to sort of do a bit of everything at the moment. So of course, we still, we say, I'll be really good to do this project because, it will address, anti-racism, or it will address housing policy, but I mean, these are also themes that come through the general discourse of the city as well. So that in a way that determines our projects too, because the Manchester Art Gallery is a city council institution. Our program is directly constructed to respond to the urgencies determined democratically by the city council as a political whole. And at the Whitworth, we basically are inviting people to come to us, and I think through to have relationships, and through those relationships, you discover urgencies and needs and requirements that then shape the program. But it was interesting with Oakland Projects that it was a local group who contacted Suzanne directly in Los Angeles to say, hey, can we do Oakland Projects? And then for her to say, well, actually, we're just about to do something in Manchester, 200 meters from you.
Yeah.
So yeah, and also, the clinicians, the hospitals, people do come to us with proposals and propositions and questions that you can then answer. So the more you do that, the more it ingrains the behavior.
Yeah. Sandro. Well, that was a most inspiring presentation. Before I ask my question to you, and we also have some questions coming up in the chat, I'd like to remind Mike not to throw away his drawing, because that I'm sure will get featured in our publication at some point in time. We're planning to publish the transcript of these webinars, and I think we have the first visual in hand there. And so, Alistair, I was quite intrigued by your, perhaps we can call it alternative model of seeing the museum work and function, which is obviously community centered, and it reminds me very much of a public space. So in a way, you're funded by the authorities, by the government, so you don't have the risk that other museums in the US and elsewhere in Europe are running at this point in time. I mean, how do you see your role in this? Because it seems that from the way you've been presenting your projects, you're moving forward at a very good pace. And when we see all this happening, I mean, in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, I'm sure that there are some projects that you had to shelve. And in fact, one of the questions referred to the digital. I mean, how can all this relate to a digital interface, given that there is a question of digital literacy as well, perhaps, which is more present in the case of the communities that you're working with?
Yeah, it's well, it's in a way, it's such a calamity, the COVID situation, because what that means, of course, all this stuff of working with people is the last thing you can do in a museum. And the only thing you could now do in a museum under the COVID restrictions is just go in and look at paintings on the wall in the traditional social distanced way. Everybody's going in the museum when they just they keep themselves to themselves. There are no activities, workshops, education, none of that can happen. Just looking is the only thing that's permitted. So it's a bit of a like a major backward step at the moment. But yes, of course, we are doing as much as we can online, and actually, the digital space does offer a way of working with people that allows you to continue. So the work we've been doing, for example, with Oakland Projects is essentially a media literacy project. It's about using media to give agency to youth. So you can do that to a certain extent in the digital sphere. Suzanne's also working on another project with us at the Manchester Art Gallery to increase labour rights for older women of ethnicity in the city. And that has been solely conducted through Zoom. For the past 4 months, we've been holding weekly workshops with groups on Zoom with older women. And actually it works pretty well at the moment, because obviously, that's become the major platform through isolation, and actually helps evolve the project. So there is lots you can do, but I'm a great believer in physical connectivity and kinetic learning, mutual kinetic learning. In fact, at the Whitworth, in our mission and vision, one of the 3 main pillars is learning through making and doing. that you learn in these physical ways, in ways that you don't learn in the cerebral. And this is one of the major functions I see for a museum, not just in terms of traditional education and pedagogy, but also in terms of research with university partners. So yeah, digital space is, but only so much. I mean, I don't know about you, but everybody around me seems to have hit the wall in terms of their capacity to do things on a screen. And I think we're yet to see the psychological and physiological impact of this way of working, depending on how long it lasts. So yeah, digital, yes, of course, but there aren't many public spaces left in our current economic system. Museums are one of the, certainly in the UK, are pretty much the last free public spaces that can be used in a democratic way by everybody. Libraries and museums and galleries.
That's really interesting. So when you look at the digital interface and the fact that you cannot do so much, but on the other hand, we're much more connected than ever before. I mean, we are neighbors. We are in 3 different places on this planet, and we're having this conversation. So when we look at your idea of a constituency, of a museum constituency, how does that morph? How do you think that is going to develop? And where are the boundaries? I mean, this is the umpteenth question, no? I mean, what do we mean by a community? In your presentation, you're referring to a constituency, yes, which in a way connects to a certain relationship between the museum and the public out there. So there is perhaps a closer relationship there. How do you see this moving forward?
The way I see it is that yes, I don't use the word audience anymore as much as possible, and I don't use the word community as much as I can, if possible. And I prefer to, yes, use the word constituents and users, because constituent isn't just in the political sense of the voting population who live in your city. In a way, it's the groups and networks who constitute the institution. And I, say a lot to my teams, you are also constituent groups. You are also users of the museum. You are part of the networks who benefit from this institution because you get paid, and the volunteers do, and the interns do, and the people who come to use the toilets to take drugs, and everybody who's using the institution is a constituent. And then that also equally applies online in very interesting ways. So that in a way, the constituent, and I think a lot of us have probably seen it, certainly people who are involved in museums have seen it during lockdown, is the reach that a museum has in the digital space is incredible. I mean, also look at this look at this conversation tonight, and where all the different places people have come from, and actually that is very exciting. And I think that's something that the heart of why the Arte Útil archive is also very very pertinent in all this. In a way, that project is a network of people internationally collaborating on this project. And the lexicon has been translated spontaneously into 7 languages now. There are Arte Útil kind of nodes of activity in South America, North America, Iran, Pakistan, Africa. Somebody's translating it into Welsh, and it suddenly becomes this kind of this international virtual constituency, or these virtual network of people all connected through an idea or through a proposition. And we've just actually acquired the website for our collection as a sort of conceptual proposition. We've acquired something which you can actually get for free online as part of our art collection, and actually wrote a very interesting acquisitions contract where we replaced the word ownership with usership, which was quite fun. Drove our lawyers mad, but we did it in the end.
Well, I think you might be missing a translation in Maltese where we can have a conversation.
Let's do it.
So perhaps Carmen would like to.
Yes, one perhaps final question because we're almost running out of time. Sandro mentioned the digital divide, which is obviously an issue, a worrying issue in most societies. Which brings me back to the issue of voice. Now, in your presentation and in your response to our questions, you did mention that, you know, people are coming forward, you know, with ideas, with themes, etc., etc. But all of us who work within communities know that there are voices which are heard more than others, voices which are stronger, you know, than others. So what exactly are you doing to make sure that, you know, this polyphony of voices is really heard, including the subordinated, traditionally subordinated and disenfranchised, you know, voices?
Yes, those are really through physical connections, and you do that. You can do that through networks, because you never directly are going to know those people, as you say, because it's usually the people who come forward. So you have to work at it, basically. I mean, it's quite interesting. A good example is, and this is another project I didn't show you. I could, yeah. I mean, I have another. There's another museum I'm in charge of as well in the city, which is in and amongst all those neighborhoods. It's called Platte Hall. And it's a big 18th century Georgian mansion house, actually a slave owner's house that was historically our museum of costume. And I basically closed it as a museum of costume. Those collections are being integrated into the central city collections. And we're going to remake this house as basically like a model of a user-generated museum with no exhibition space, purely based around activity. And we're at the moment doing consultancy work to ask all the neighborhoods around how they would be involved, what they would do, how could they use it, etc., etc. And of course, the first wave is all the noisy people, all the gatekeepers, all the people who were usually, you know, first to, you know. So we've very clearly said, that's fine, we'll include you in our discussions, but we want to go beyond you. We want to go to the people who don't even know this place exists.
Yeah.
Who don't even...
Yeah, for me, Alistair, the issue of voice is fundamental, because unless we intervene decisively and surgically, museums will certainly reproduce, you know, the social relations status quo. And obviously that means more colonization, etc., etc., etc. With that note, Alistair, I think we bring this webinar to an end. I should like to thank you profusely for your, you know, intellectual engagement and for your passion. Thank you, Mike, for being once again with us and asking, you know, difficult questions once again. Thank you, participants, for being with us through Zoom and through Facebook. Our next conversation will be with Christine Alford, and that will happen on Saturday, 28th November, 9:30 CET time. Until then, Saha, goodbye from us. Ciao.
Thank you. Thanks very much.